Okay, seed saving 101. So this is an intro to seed saving. My aim is to leave you guys in a place where you feel comfortable and competent even to go out into the garden this year and save some seeds. And seed saving really is it's a journey. So don't think that you're suddenly going to be a seed saving whiz and you need to know everything to start doing it. It can be very, very, very basic at its heart. And then people do PhDs and write biblical sized books on these things. So don't get overwhelmed by the details. We're going to cover some kind of overarching theories and techniques. And as long as you can walk into the garden with some of those techniques and just give it a go, then that's really, it's an extension of gardening in that sense. You don't just suddenly become an awesome gardener that knows everything. You probably successfully grow a couple of things the first year and get better year on year on year. And I want you to have the same idea with seed saving. Some people are very intimidated by it, but you needn't be. It's a very simple act. In fact, the plant does most of the work. So, okay, so to just ground ourselves in where we are and what we're doing, it's always worth remembering that seeds are truly incredible. So this is one of my favorite quotes. Think of the fierce energy concentrated in an acorn. You bury it in the ground and it explodes into a giant oak. Bury a sheep and nothing happens but decay. So that's the power of seeds. Let me share one of my favorite books. If you kind of want to get into I can't see myself, so I hope you can see this. This is The Seed Underground, A Growing Revolution to Save Food by Genus. She's a awesome author. It's a very narrative driven book, a lot of seed stories. And if you're kind of get excited about the heirloom varieties out there and all that kind of stuff, then this book is truly inspiring. But she says one thing in here which I think is very poignant that I want to share with you. She writes,
Chris,
yes.
can I just say that your video is not showing up?
Oh, it did that thing. we knew it was going to do that. It's like the doorbell keeps ringing. It's fun. The host has asked me to start my video. Okay, there you go.
Okay, now we can see you. Thank you.
No worries. Cheers. Okay, so now you should have the screen share and the video. Is that right?
Correct.
Cool. Okay, so this is Genus. Our seeds are disappearing. When seed varieties vanish from the marketplace, they evaporate not only from collective memory, but also from the evolutionary story of the earth. Seeds are more like Bengal tigers than vinyl records, which can simply be remanufactured. Once gone, seeds cannot be resurrected. Goodbye, cool seeds. Goodbye, history of civilization. Goodbye, food. A seed makes itself. A seed doesn't need a geneticist or hybridist or publicist or matchmaker, but it needs help. Sometimes it needs a moth or a wasp or a gust of wind. Sometimes it needs a farm and it needs a farmer. It needs a garden and a gardener. It needs you. And that's you. That's not just me. That's what the seed needs to continue is our input to continue to grow these varieties. And in many ways over the last 100 years, we've seen a kind of a degradation for the loss of the respect of the seed, and some of this heritage is being quickly lost. And so please know that I'm really grateful that you're here to learn about seed saving, that I truly passionately think it's something that we all need to really delve into to continue to preserve this genetic diversity that's been built up over many, many, many generations. It's a real part of our history, cultural history, agricultural history, and it's kind of on our shoulders to continue it forward so that we don't just end up in a monoculture world of disappointing food. And so one of the more technical slides that I like to show that kind of really demonstrates this point is this one that you're seeing here. And it's, to me, it kind of speaks to the genius of our ancestors in that they were able to recognize a wild, well, in this case, kind of a weed, a crop that's just growing on its own, and know that it had various edible parts, but none of those edible parts were particularly fantastic for human consumption. But through the act of selective seed saving, they were able to look at these plants and go, oh, well, this one has slightly larger leaves and the leaves taste slightly better, or it's slightly more productive, or it's slightly more disease resistant. And they were able to save seeds from progressive generations of that plant to select for that trait that they deemed desirable. And so in that way, they were able to pull out this leaf structure into some of the crops that we know as kale and collards. But then they also took the very same plant, the same plant at the top is Brassica oleracea, and they recognized different traits, and they selected that same plant in different directions. And this is one of the craziest plants this has been done with, because from that one kind of mother plant, Brassica oleracea, we selected it. You can see on this picture, like the terminal buds were selected from this very small bud on the wild crop to be these massive terminal buds, which we know and call cabbage today. All the lateral buds became Brussels sprouts. And these are things that we can see in the wild plant, but we see them as very small things that we may not recognize the potential of. But these people recognized the potential and did the selective seed saving work and were able to develop these crops into all these different ones that we see down here. So broccoli is the one that people tend to resonate most with, because if you've ever grown broccoli and not harvested it soon enough, people are often surprised to see that that dense green head that we know of as broccoli is actually just a very compact flower head, and it will burst into yellow flowers if we allow it to go to flower. Which obviously we don't see if we're just buying it in the supermarket, but as home gardeners, we get that extra insight into some of the botany behind these plants. And it's that insight that's really important when we become seed savers. So Brassica oleracea is a very cool example of the power of selective seed saving, but it shows up all throughout the food that we know and love. Okay, so what does it mean to be a seed saver? This is kind of like the nub of the question. And some people think of seed saving just as the act of, grabbing that seed from the garden. And that's kind of analogous to gardening being just grabbing the carrot once it's grown. Like, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into getting that carrot to that stage before we can go and harvest it. So gardening is more than just grabbing it. And really, when it comes down to seed saving, it's knowing a lot about the flowers and the botany behind the plant, so that we can effectively answer this question or fulfill this aim. So as a seed saver, our primary aim as seed savers is to carry a genetically distinct variety from one season to the next. So what that really means when it comes down to it is that if I plant a Cherokee purple tomato in my garden this year, and I save seeds from it, I want to be able to grow a Cherokee purple tomato next year. And I want it to be, pretty much the same, if not improved from my own selection work. But, I'm expecting to have a Cherokee purple tomato. If it turns into something completely different, I'm probably going to be disappointed. And maybe in our modern world of supermarket convenience, then that just becomes an inconvenience. But if we think about true food security, then my winter squash that I know will store for 9 months and get me through winter food, I want to know that like Tahitian butternut, that real good food crop, is going to continue to have those fantastic storage qualities, which means I need to maintain that genetic purity of that variety so that I know that those traits that are useful to me will continue to exist from year to year. And if it suddenly turns into a winter squash that's not quite as big and doesn't store as well, then that's really going to impact my personal food security. And so there's there's bigger picture at play here than just being able to have my own wonderful Cherokee purple tomato. Not that that's not important. So carrying on this genetic purity is important in seed saving. And it brings up kind of a key point that we need to recognize right at the beginning. Not all seeds are the same. So when we talk about seed saving, we need to be thinking about open pollinated varieties. So there's not a whole lot of terminology, but this is a critical terminology that you need to get in your head. Open pollinated varieties are seed varieties that will do just what we've been talking about. They will have stable enough genetics that if I save the seeds from that variety and plant them the next year, then I will continue to see the same traits. So that seems like a pretty obvious thing, like surely all seeds are capable of doing that. But what we've experienced in the last 100 years is the introduction of hybrid. So these are two like sides of the table. We have open pollinated seeds and we have hybrid seeds. And hybrids are created, and you don't need to know too much or go too deep into this, but hybrids are created by basically having two very pure parent lines that are intentionally crossed. And then we get like the child of that cross. And so on a seed packet or in a seed catalog, or when you're shopping for seeds, you'll see those hybrid seeds either labeled clearly as hybrid or F1 or F1 hybrid. And it's like the first generation of that cross. And in terms of agriculture, they were considered to be this wonderful thing because you got uniform crop, you got hybrid vigor, you got predictability. And these sort of things were important to farmers. In the short term, they got higher yields. But what happens if you save seeds from a hybrid in that second season? So you bought the F1, so basically you save seeds and you're planting the F2, then you get like a remix up of the genetics of the parent plants, and you end up with something that's not predictable, and your Cherokee Purple wouldn't continue to be your Cherokee Purple. So that's an important thing to distinguish, and you can go very deep down that hole and the politics of hybrids and the pros and the cons, and it's never black and white, but we don't have time for that today. But just know that when you're looking for seeds to just save seed from, you need to be considering open pollinated seeds. Now within open pollinated, there's this subset which are known as heirloom seeds. Heirloom seeds are basically just really old open pollinated seeds. So they are varieties that have stood the test of time and have been saved for many, many generations, usually considered to have existed before World War II, and obviously still exist today, so that we can plant these heirlooms today. But know that seeds are alive and forever changing, and by saving those seeds in different regions, then they're gonna like change subtly over time. And it's unlikely that if we could go back in time and see an heirloom from 1920 and compare it to an heirloom from 2020, that it would be identical. So just bear that in mind, that it is an evolving field, but it's about that predictability from season to season. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we maintain that predictability? This is the big question. What will threaten the purity of my seed variety? So if we're trying to maintain that predictability and that purity, then what's going to threaten that? And the very simple answer is pollen from another variety of the same species. And we call this cross-pollination. When we get pollen from another variety that gets into my variety, then it gets all mixed up, and effectively we're creating our own hybrid, which can kind of be fun. You know, you can start your own little path of backyard vegetable breeding, and I would encourage that in terms of experimentation. But just for starting off with Seed Saving 101, we want to stop that from happening. So seed saving is about stopping it from happening. Breeding is about encouraging it. So, so species, we need to know about species. And some of this is going to be very, very basic science, but I speak to people all the time about this, and it's important we have a very clear handle on what this means. Okay, so Beta vulgaris, this is a species binominal. The first word is always capitalized, always italicized, and refers to the genus. So in terms of this plant hierarchy, we have the family, we have the genus, we have the species, and then we have the varieties below that. So the beta is the genus level, and then when you tag on this term vulgaris, those two words together form the species. So Beta vulgaris is the species. You don't need to know Latin, you just need to understand the shapes of the words and whether they are the same. So this is actually beets and Swiss chard, if you're interested in what we're talking about. What's really important here is we're talking about varieties of the same species. So what it comes down to is if I'm planting one variety that says Beta vulgaris on my seed packet or seed catalog, then it will cross with another variety that if it says Beta vulgaris. If it does not say Beta vulgaris, it will not cross. So I'm going to say that one more time because this is really important. If the two words are identical, they can cross. If the two words are different, any part of them are different, then it cannot cross. So very simple rule, right? So lock that into your brain for when you're looking through the seed catalogs and the packets for seed saving. So I just want to kind of push home the point that the common names that we give to plants are not very useful when it comes to seed saving. And actually, just last week, I was tagged in a comment on Facebook with this very question. There was confusion around whether like a cucumber could cross with a melon, and it really comes back down to this species recognition and what's what. But cucumber and melon don't really help you. You have to know what the species are. So we've just talked about beets and Swiss chard. Both those common name crop types are Beta vulgaris. So your beets will cross with your Swiss chard, and your Swiss chard will cross with your beets. Your beets will cross with each other. You know, they're all the same on a species level. And that's kind of fun as a kind of, you know, a botanical observer. I'm hoping that you'll go into the garden and start seeing plants and flowers in slightly different ways once you get into seed saving, because we know that Swiss chards are grown for their greens. And most of us probably already know that you can eat the beet greens. And if you look at them together, they look very, very similar. And the same is true in reverse. Technically, the root of the Swiss chard it's not poisonous. I don't know if it's truly edible. I've tried once and it's really tough and fibrous and nasty, and I wouldn't recommend it. You can trust me on that one. And what we're seeing is back to those Genus ancestors who had the wild Beta vulgaris, and they decided to select out the root for this large, sweet, storable, delicious, colorful root. And there we had the line that became beets. And then somebody else selected out the leaves for these large, colorful, lush leaves. And so even though it's the same species, it's split in these two different directions, and we have Swiss chard and beets. And the Australian name for Swiss chard is silver beet. They actually recognize it in the term. So we've already looked at that chart before of the Brassica oleracea, and that's what we're seeing here with collards and cauliflower. On a species level, both collards and cauliflower are Brassica oleracea, so they will cross with each other. And again, hopefully light bulbs are going off in your brain and you're like, oh yeah, so when I grow cauliflower and I see those leaves, they kind of look like collards, and they're very, very similar, which means you can eat the leaves of cauliflower. And although collards don't form the tight head of a cauliflower, you can eat the floral buds of collards when they flower. So they're both pretty clear, right? But then we jump down to collards and kale, and this is where you need to start being really, really careful, because to look at it in the garden, you would think that collards and kale are very, very similar. And when you look in a seed catalog, you'll see that all the collard varieties are Brassica oleracea. So we're pretty firm that collards are this one species. But when you look at all the different species, those Latin binominals on the kale page, you'll start seeing some of them are Brassica oleracea, but some of them are Brassica napus. And you're like, oh, this is interesting. There's two different species of kale going on here. One of them is the same species as collards. So now we know that those particular species, which happen to be the European kales, the dinosaur kale, are the Brassica oleracea, and they will cross with my collards. But then I've got this whole other subset of Brassica napus, which are the Siberian kales, that are a completely different species. So even though in this kale page, they're all called kale, but there's more difference between Brassica napus and Brassica oleracea kale than there is between my Brassica oleracea kale and my Brassica oleracea collards. So this is really just to say common names are nonsical, and be very careful when you're looking at the seed catalogs in terms of what will cross and what won't cross. Don't just assume that because it's kale and collards they're different, or because they're kale and kale they're the same. Same is true in sweet peppers and hot peppers. We see most of them are Capsicum annum, which for hot peppers and sweet peppers, they will cross. And that means we can have accidental crossing of a hot pepper gene into a sweet pepper, and we can make a hot sweet pepper, which will surprise you. But there's also a few other species within the hot peppers that are different, and you can start planting different species so you don't get that crossing if you want to manage it that way. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about squash later. That's one of my crop-specific examples we're going to dig a bit deeper into, so I won't go too deep into that one, but just know that once we get into squash, then to call something a squash could mean any number of things once we get to the species level. So any good seed company will list this on the seed packet and in the catalog. They'll list the Latin name, and as a seed saver, that's what you should be paying attention to. Okay. I've got a link to this slideshow at the end, so you can go back and reference some of these materials. So this more text-heavy information isn't to go through right now, but it's so you have it as a resource. Again, you'll often find this replicated in seed catalogs, and I brought a couple of my favorite books to share. This one is The Seed Garden, The Art and Practice of Seed Saving, put out by Seed Savers Exchange. This is kind of my go-to. It's got a whole bunch of good technical information in the beginning about how to seed save, and then it breaks down every crop by its species and gives you way more information about what you need. So I think it's important, again, to reiterate that we're going to cover some like overarching techniques and tools so that you can feel confident to give this a go, but don't worry too much about remembering all the details of all the crops. I don't remember all the details of all the crops. I have a reference manual that will give me that information in a handy chart that I can just go and go, oh, okay, this is what I need to do with this specific crop. That there's way too much just to keep in your brain. I'm going to show you this one too. I don't use this one as much, but I like it. It's called The Complete Guide to Saving Seeds. It includes flowers, fruits, trees, and shrubs in a way that the seed garden doesn't. That one does have some herbs and flowers, but it's way more vegetable focused. This one does a real good job of covering some of the trees and the shrubs that you wouldn't necessarily think of quite as much. So I keep this one around as a second reference if I can't find something in that one. And then again, there's always Google. Okay, I'm gonna try and go back to my Zoom. Okay, I just wanted to kind of pause there with that kind of introduction and species and stuff, and just see if we built up any questions before jumping into. We're going to go through 4 different crops that will really highlight the tools and techniques you need to save seeds. So we're going to get very practical in this next section, but I just wanted to give a moment to see if there's any. Nothing? That's good with me. I'm happy to keep pushing forward. Okay. Okay, so we've established that varieties within the same species will cross-pollinate. As seed savers, we don't want that to happen. So seed saving really becomes the art of controlling what pollen goes where, or which plants have sex with which plants. So that's kind of where we're at as seed savers. Let's just jump into the 4 different crops that I got that are going to show some of the differences and that kind of thing as we go through. So tomatoes. Actually, I just want to say one last thing on this one. We usually get to about this stage and somebody will start panicking that they've already planted their entire garden and they've put all these different varieties of the same species next to each other, and they think it's going to ruin their vegetable garden. So let's be very clear that we're talking about seed saving, and it only affects the production of the seed. So apart from a very few rare cases, this season's crop, the fruit or the thing that you're going to eat, will not be affected by what you can plant whatever you want, wherever you want, and it won't be affected, with a few short exceptions that we'll talk about at the end. It's only the seed crop that we're talking about here in terms of what we're about to get into. So don't worry about it from an eating perspective. This is from a seed saving perspective. Okay, tomatoes. I personally think tomatoes are one of the easiest crops to start with, and hopefully you're about to learn why. It always starts with the flower. So we're talking about controlling pollen and what pollen goes where. The flower is the pollen producing part of the plant, so we always start with the flower. So what we're seeing here is a quite a beautiful tomato flower, blown up big. And to dig a bit deeper into that, what you're seeing right in the middle, the sticky out bit, is a cone. It's the anther cone. So it's actually the male producing, or the pollen producing part of the flower is this cone that's sticking out. And what you can't see is the stigma. The stigma is inside that cone. And the stigma is the female part of the flower that receives the pollen. So we have the male pollen producing, and we have the female pollen receiving. And in this situation with a tomato flower, the male producing anther, the pollen, is completely surrounding the female receptor. So as a seed saver, we're like in celebration mode because we're like, there's hardly any chance that pollen from another flower is gonna get to that stigma, because my flower is totally, my female part of the flower is totally encased by the male part of the flower. So we call this this flower a perfect flower because it has both the male and the female sexual organs in the flower. And then it's self-pollinating because it's highly likely to pollinate itself with its own pollen. And it's self-fertile, which means that that pollen is well received by the female stigma and will happily do its thing and produce the fruit. So this flower is like everything we want to see as a seed saver. It's just like the tomato has this covered. We don't need to worry about pollen from other plants or anything like that. So that's pretty exciting. And the reason I would say save tomato seeds, it's really quite easy. Now there is a but. There's always a but. Let me show you this picture. So again, a little bit smaller, but hopefully you can see the two tomato flowers next to each other. The flower on the right looks a little bit like the flower in the last slide. We have that anther cone that's going over the stigma, and you can clearly imagine that it's very unlikely that pollen from another flower is going to get involved. But if we look at the picture of the flower on the left, you can see at the top of that cone, there's this little sticky out bit. That sticky out bit is the stigma. It's an exerted stigma. And so that means that that particular flower, that we call it a promiscuous flower, it's much more likely to receive pollen via an insect from another flower, another tomato flower. So that kind of screws us up a little bit, because we're like, oh, damn it. So this tomato is promiscuous and may, or is more likely to cross-pollinate, and this other one is totally unlikely to cross-pollinate. Luckily, the promiscuous flowers it's kind of a wild tomato trait, and it's largely being bred out of tomatoes, and you don't see it that often. It tends to be the kind of the beefsteaky, old-time heirloom varieties. You may go into the garden and look at the flowers and see this. And I'm sure a lot of you are growing tomatoes right now. Mine have just started flowering. So go out there, not right now, we've got some more presentation, but later go out there and have a look at the flowers, and just pay attention, have a look, peel back that cone, see what's inside it, and it can kind of be a real fun backyard science experiment. So what this means in reality is the anther cone with the retracted stigma, you can plant tomatoes pretty close to each other, like 10 feet apart, and not even worry about it. The ones with the exerted stigma, you just need a little bit more space. So in general, tomatoes get split into potato leaf varieties and normal tomatoes. And the potato leaf varieties usually get like a 50-foot distance. You got to keep that variety 50 foot away. Whereas the normal tomatoes, they say 10 to 20 feet. So it's very achievable achievable to grow multiple varieties of tomatoes in your garden and save pure seed from all those tomatoes just by paying a little bit of attention. So that means with tomatoes, they're doing their own thing. You can see here that we have the flowers. Once the flowers are pollinated, we get the fruit production. Once the fruit grows to maturity, inside we have the seeds. And so the plant is truly doing everything. And because there's a very low chance of this cross-pollination issue, then there's very little need for us to get involved, apart from maybe saying, okay, I'm going to put my Cherokee purple in this corner of the garden, and I'm going to put my Amish paste in this corner just to give a little bit of distance, and that's all you need to worry about. So most people, without even knowing and planning for it this year, you could probably go out and save tomato seeds this season and have them to plant yourself next season. And the wonderful thing with seeds is you plant one seed and you get a crazy amount of seeds back. Like it's returns you'll never see on Wall Street. So seed saving is a really good investment. You can start participating in seed swaps. There's lots of online seed swapping communities, and just kind of a real good feeling of planting your own seeds is kind of fun. So this is just tomatoes as they get a bit older. One of the advantages of saving your own seed is that you can start doing what our Genus ancestors did, which is kind of steer these varieties in a direction that suits you. And that could be, you know, start selecting for tomatoes that survive the longest, which is what I do with these garden peach ones, that they were naturally quite disease resistant. And then I noticed at the end of the season, some of the plants would be dying back and some of them would still be putting on fruit. So I would always save seed from the plants that survive the longest through all the things that will kill tomatoes, you know, pretty much everything. So that's selective seed saving for blight resistant. You could do it for flavor. You could be in your garden. This could be in the kitchen. You could have all your tomatoes in your kitchen and you could just be biting into them and go, oh, like just be blown away by the flavor of one of those tomatoes. You've maybe just eaten 25% of the seeds, but you could scoop the rest out and straight away you're saving seeds and selecting for the tomato that blows you away in terms of flavor. So you can really start doing a lot of fun stuff and see pretty quick returns on that selection over years. And in terms of like selective seed saving, it's the same theory as planting trees. The best time to plant trees is 10 years ago. And the second best time is today. So same with selective seed saving. Imagine if you'd started 10 years ago selecting for flavor, what would you have today? And then imagine forward for the next decade. Okay, so tomatoes are that easy. We're gonna go through the specific like processing and pulling the seeds out right at the end because it's kind of the same for most seeds. So you'll actually have a handle on that. But in terms of controlling what pollen goes where, the tomatoes pretty much got it covered, potentially a little bit of distance. So other like top candidates for super simple seed saving that you can just launch right into this year would be beans, peas, and lettuce. They all have these flowers that are very unpromiscuous, very unlikely to cross-pollinate. You can save seeds from all of those crop types. The one difference, I guess, is the lettuce, because the beans and the peas, often we want the beans and the peas to eat, or we're growing them as a green pea or a green bean, and you just need to let it mature to get the full seed inside. The lettuce, you know, some of us may never have seen lettuce seed because we eat the leaves, and once it starts to bolt, we consider that, you know, we don't want the bolting because the leaves go bitter and we get rid of the plant. But if you just let that bolting, just with a couple of plants, let it do its natural thing, then you'll get flowers and seeds maturing at the top, and you can go ahead and harvest those seeds very, very easily without worrying about cross-pollination. There's a tomato breeder called Frank Morton who he tries to create these crosses so they can breed new varieties, and he like forces lettuce flowers together, and even with like actually putting two different varieties of flowers right next to each other, still only gets about 5% cross-pollination. So you don't need to worry about it with lettuce. Okay, next up we have okra. I would be remiss if I did not speak about okra, but it's also a good candidate for demonstrating a few points. What you're seeing there is a very mature okra, which is important for seed saving. We'll come back to that in a little while. But again, we need to start with the flower. So this is in some ways a very similar picture to what we saw with the tomato, but in many ways it's completely different. It's still a perfect flower. So we're still seeing a flower with male and female reproductive organs, which means it's capable and able to self-pollinate, and it's self-fertile. So that self-pollination will form a fruit with viable seeds. So this is cool. We have a perfect flower. This makes life easy as a seed saver. But what we're also seeing is this beautiful flower that is just like open petaled and brightly colored, and it's highly likely, and if you spend any time around okra, like insects are going to be all over it. They're going to love this flower and they're going to be visiting it. So as soon as you see a lot of insect activity on a flower, your brain can start going, there's a pretty good chance that there's going to be cross-pollination here. And then when you actually get into the flower itself, the stigma, the female receiving part, is that red bit right at the end. And then the column behind it, or the kind of like the yellow section, that's the stamial column, which has all the anther sacs. So that's the male producing pollen. So the pollen is slightly behind the stigma. And so it's got to kind of like be shaken and travel to get to the stigma. So there's a little bit more like mechanics that need to go on, and the insects can be a part of that pollination process. So this is a flower that's totally capable of self-pollinating, but it's kind of hedging its bets and saying, hey, insects, you can help me out a little bit here. And that means that we've got this chance of cross-pollination. So with tomatoes, we only needed that 10 feet, 20 feet between varieties, maybe 50 feet if it had the sticky out stigma. But with these guys, we need like, sometimes up to 800 feet between varieties. So my Clemson spineless would have to be separated by distance from my red burgundy by 800 feet if I didn't want accidental cross-pollination. And for the home gardener, that's often unrealistic. And for the okra enthusiast, just planting 2 varieties is depressing. So we need another solution. And so that's where we jump into the next kind of method or technique that you can take as a seed saver. If you can't isolate by distance, because that distance has got too large, and that's one of those referenceable facts, you don't need to remember them all, then you need another technique. It's also, okra is a good one to reference for, if it's a perfect flower, then if you're going to save seeds from that flower, you obviously can't then eat the fruit. So tomatoes you can kind of get away with because you can slice it open and scoop out the seeds and still eat the flesh and save the seeds. But with okra, by the time those seeds are mature, they're like this, and you wouldn't want to be eating the pod. So you kind of, to save a seed pod, you're sacrificing a single fruit. But I put this picture in here just to kind of show that it doesn't matter if we sacrifice 2 or 3 pods on a plant to seed production, because the okra and the tomatoes and the beans, they'll all continue to produce a whole bunch of other pods that we can continue to eat, as long as we've got one pod that we know has pure seeds in it that we've labeled and we let go through to maturity. So that's kind of another misconception, is that just because I'm saving seeds from this plant, then I have to like sacrifice all food production. But you only need to sacrifice, a couple of pods from each plant to get real good seed stock, and you still get a bunch of okra to eat. So you can have your cake and eat it when it comes to seed saving in most cases. And the labeling is important. Okay, so I've actually labeled this with, some selection points so that I can kind of make selections on that. But and as long as you're labeling it in some way, shape, or form, so that you know that this is a variety that you're going to let go all the way through to full maturity before saving the seeds from. Okay, I think, yeah. So this is a short video. It's about 6 minutes long, and it gives me a chance to stop talking. And although I keep talking in the video, sorry. And it kind of shows you what I can't show you in my garden because nothing is flowering yet. So hopefully you can see a little bit of like real seed saving in the video. My screen's gone really dark. Are you guys seeing this? Unable to play video. Oh, that's sad. Oh, maybe not. let me try one thing, and then I can explain it, and you'll be sad that you didn't get to see the video.
I wish I could help, Chris, but I'm I'm not sure why it's not playing.
Yeah, it worked before, but it didn't seem to be working on the screen share. And now I'm not even seeing the video in here. Where did you go? Huh. Okay, I'll try this one thing. You can still see my screen, right?
Correct.
Okay. So it doesn't seem to like videos on screen share. Okay, sorry about that, folks. Like I say, though, you are going to have a copy of a link to these slides. So if you're super sad that you didn't get to see that video, then you can always go back and look up yourself. So I will pretend that I'm in my field and recreate this wonderful video for you. I'm just going to press it one more time because I'm an optimist at heart. Damn it. Okay, sorry. Okay, I do happen to have an okra pod with me, and I usually have seed-saving baggies lying around. Oh, look at that. I didn't even plan this, and I have everything I need. Okay, so we saw that picture of the beautiful flower, which is right here. So as soon as it opens, then insects have had a chance to get in it, which means that they've also had a chance to take the pollen and put it somewhere else, which is what we're trying to avoid. Seed savers controlling what pollen goes where. Okra growers will recognize this, but if not, just go out and be your botanical observer, and you'll see that on an okra plant that the bud starts off small and begins to swell and swell and swell, and sometimes you can just see a little bit of that cream petal color just before it opens. And you definitely want to get it before it opens at all. And I've got to the stage now where I can see the bud and know that it's probably going to open in the next 24 hours. And you can kind of just learn that by being with the okra. So I've got this bud like this that I know is just about to open up into this beautiful flower, and I know that it's a perfect flower, so it's self-pollinating, self-fertile. So just before that opens, I'll come through and I'll put a bag over the flower. You can use any bag that's fine enough to keep insects out. SoTruSeed sells these. You can use those paint strainer bags. You can use paper bags, but I always worry about the rain and the humidity that we get here. So anyway, I cinch that over my flower before it opens. Okra flowers will open and they only live for a day, so they'll open and then die within 24 hours. So that it opens inside there. Usually wind and everything is enough just to shake the pollen and do pretty good pollination without any additional help. If you're not doing many of these and you really want it to take, you could go through and kind of do a little bit of flicking and get involved with it a little bit, but basically it'll happen on its own inside the bag. So this is probably, it takes you 5 seconds to go and pop a bag on. And then you come back the next day and you take the bag off. The flower's usually kind of like getting a little bit icky at that point, usually just falls off with the bag. And you're left with that little tiny okra nubbin that is basically the ovary of the plant that is being fertilized. Make sure you tie something around the stalk to know that this is the seed-saving pod that you want to keep pure seeds from. I just use a ribbon, like that landscaping fabric, the bright orange stuff. I just tie it around. And so when you see my fields, I grow a lot of different varieties of okra. So last year we did 48 different varieties of okra. So you look down my field and every plant randomly has a couple of these bright pink or bright orange tags on them. But that's just so that I know, or my field help knows that they're the ones not to harvest. So we
Chris,
leave them.
do you
And again, then the plant does it itself. So okra is really easy for those 2 additional steps of just bagging a bud, removing and tying a ribbon around. Then that's all you need to do to get pure seed from an okra variety. And so I do that for all my varieties. And then the pod will grow to get to this real mature stage.
Chris, do you mind tilting your screen down just a little bit so that we can see a little bit better?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. So these are the mature pods where they go brown and woody. And on the inside, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but that's where the seeds are in the chambers. Dry seeds. I don't know if you can see that, but that's how easy it is to save okra seeds, even if you have multiple varieties of okra close to each other. So I don't worry about the isolation by distance because it's hard to achieve. I just always intend to bag a couple of the flowers. And then this is an opportunity where you can start making decisions on your plants. Maybe you've noticed that, again, with the tomatoes, one plant's a little bit healthier, so I'm just going to save okra pods from one plant or a couple of plants. It's nice to maintain some genetic diversity. If you just save one pod from one plant, then you're really just getting the genetics from that plant. And we would like a little bit of diversity in the population just to maintain some genetic preservation. So I like to, pick the top 10 to 20% of my plant population. If I've got 20 plants, I'll just pick a couple of those plants and save seeds from them. And that way I'm getting a little bit of diversity, but I'm also making pretty strong selection to steer it in the way I want. So yeah, okra is in the easy category, but it's the next step, just because you can't just let it do its thing like beans and tomatoes if you've got multiple varieties in the same space. If you're just growing one variety of okra, if you're a diehard Clemson spineless fan, then go ahead and just let a couple of pods go woody, and you've saved seed without any extra effort at all. So it can be that simple if you're just going to grow one variety. Okay, so other plants that kind of share those pollination characteristics are peppers and eggplants. So they're both got perfect flowers, capable of pollinating themselves, but they're promiscuous enough that you're going to get fairly large isolation distances because the insects are going to share pollen between those plants. And you can apply similar techniques in terms of bagging the flower, or even with some of these plants that stay quite short, you can kind of cover the entire plant. So you see these cages, these isolation cages that you can make out of window screen, and just put a whole cage over a plant. You've blocked out the pollinators. They will self-pollinate the flowers themselves, and you're good to go in terms of worrying about cross-pollination. Okay. Let's, have any questions popped up, Kathy? We're kind of halfway through the crop specific stuff, and then we'll get into processing after that. Are we looking okay? Looking
good. I don't see any questions related to anything besides technology in the chat.
Okay, cool. So we talked briefly about squash earlier on, but I want to jump back into it because it's a pretty exciting crop to work with. You can see here that what we've written is Cucurbita spp, and basically this means like species plural, like multiple species within the genus of Cucurbita. So if you see that in a seed catalog as a seed savior, you want to start paying attention, because you're like, oh, they're giving me a clue that's the common word squash doesn't mean much in terms of botany. It covers multiple species. So when we actually break that out, what we find is there's 5 different species within the common term that we call squash. So this actually covers squash, pumpkins, and some gourds, not all gourds. Things like the Tennessee spinning top is actually a Cucurbita pepo, and most of your summer squash are also Cucurbita pepos. So all your zucchinis and yellow squash and patty pans are all this first one here, cucurbita pepos. So they will all readily cross with each other. Same species, different varieties. Even though one's a pumpkin, one's technically a gourd, and one's a summer squash, they're all cucurbita pepos, and will cross back and forth and create some funky hybrids for you. We've probably all witnessed this as the compost squash that will grow random things and often unrecognizable. Sometimes wonderful if you're really lucky. Often stringy is more my experience. You don't tend to randomly stumble upon something unless you're quite lucky. So that's the pepos are quite a broad range. And again, most of the summer squash fall into that. So it's kind of sad news if you want to grow your yellow squash and your zucchini and save seed, you need to do something additional than just two different varieties. But moschata covers most of your butternuts. That's the main thing that falls within moschata. So that's a pretty fun species to play around with. And obviously, so you could grow a moschata and a zucchini, or a moschata and a jack-o'-lantern, and they won't cross. Maxima is most of your hubbards, your blue hubbards, those types of things. Real good storage qualities on the hubbards. So if you can grow them, then that's good to know. The Argyrosperma, my Latin isn't fantastic, but that one covers the cushaw, is the main squash that you would recognize within that species. And then actually the Ficofolia isn't widely grown at all. Sotra seed doesn't carry a cucurbita Ficofolia. It's sometimes called the fig-leafed gourd, the black-seeded melon, it sometimes gets called. It's more common in Central America, but is a fifth edible species within the genus Cucurbita. So knowing what we know so far about seed saving, then I hope some of you are going, this is a wonderful opportunity. This means that I can grow lots of different squash without worrying about cross-pollination, as long as I pay attention in my seed catalog and I can choose one pepo, one moschata, one maxima, one argiosperma, and if I can find it, a ficofolia, and I can plant them all together and they won't cross-pollinate. And I think that's a real empowering thing to know as a seed saver. If you really want your yellow squash and your zucchini, then you're going to have to take some extra steps. So back to the flower. This is the first crop that we've talked about that doesn't have a perfect flower. The flower does not have both female and male flowers the flower does not have both female and male organs within the same flower. We have on the same plant two very different flowers. And if you weren't already aware of this, then I highly encourage you to go and start looking at your squash flowers this year. You'll see one of them, this one on the left, is very straight and erect and comes out early in the season. Often you'll get a whole bunch of these male flowers opening before there's even any sign of a female flower. And when I was working at Sotra Seed, we'd often get calls saying, hey, my plant's growing all these male flowers and I'm not seeing any squash. Or they'd say, it's growing all these flowers and I'm not seeing any squash. And once we dug a bit deeper, it was putting on a whole bunch of male flowers, so that when that handful of female flowers came out, there would be a lot of available pollen for the pollination process. So this one on the right, you can see the tiny little ovary, which is what really keys you into the fact that this is a female flower. And then the flower hasn't yet opened on top. So both of these flowers have not yet opened yet, but you can still tell it's a male and a female flower. So this is monoecious, male and female, separate but on the same plant. So here you can see it's grown up a lot more. Still, we've got the, it looks at this stage the flower's opened and is probably dying. So we've already had pollination and fertilization, but that tiny, tiny ovary has developed into a fruit, which will contain the seeds. And then we've got not the clearest picture, but the male flower on the left. I think this next one, this shows it pretty clearly as they've grown up. This is actually a hybrid zucchini, but it's a good picture for the flowers, where you can see the three on the left are very clearly male. There's no ovary or fruit production. and then we've got the flowers still attached to the growing fruit on the right. So yeah, go out and look at your squash plants, and you'll see two very clear differences. And so what happens when we're talking about monoecious plants is it's got no way to pollinate itself. It just can't happen because there's got to be some way to get the pollen to transfer from the male flower to pollinate the female flower. There's got to be some mechanism of pollen transfer. And often it's insect pollination in the vegetable world. That's what we see most commonly. So if you're dealing with a monoecious plant, it's quite likely that you're going to be dealing with insect transfer. As soon as we're in the realm of insect pollination, we know that that really increases the distance that we would need to prevent cross-pollination between two varieties of the same species. So for squash, the references differ. You can look this up online and see a range of different distances. I tend to fall back on that seed garden book as a backyard gardener. So the seed garden, because they're really focused on the garden side of things, and so they tend to have the distances be a little bit closer, because you're a home gardener and a 95% chance that it won't cross-pollinate is probably enough. That's not enough for a seed grower selling to a seed company, and most seed companies will have their own specifications that they will give to the farmer when growing those seeds. But for the home gardener, for you and I, then we're usually pretty happy to have it like almost perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect, and the numbers in that book are pretty good. But for squash, we can still be talking about at least half a mile isolation, which again is usually unachievable on the average homestead. So isolation by distance isn't an option. So that makes me sad for my zucchini yellow squash scenario. So we go back to this bagging scenario like we did with the okra. So you can go ahead and bag that female flower so that it can't be cross-pollinated by anything else. But the extra step, and this is why this is kind of like, if we go through like super easy tomatoes and beans, okra and peppers, we need to take this extra step, but it's not that much because we just put a bag over the flower. This is the next step. And again, it's not hard, it's even fun, but you do have to be aware that if you bag a female flower in isolation and just left it and no pollen got to that female flower, it would die. It would just fall off. There would be no fruit production because there was no pollination. So somehow we've got to get the pollen from the male flower to the female flower. And if you're going to bag a monoecious female flower, then you basically become the pollinator. It becomes your responsibility to take that male pollen and fertilize the female flower. So that's called hand pollination, which is a pretty obvious term. Same rules apply as they did with the okra. We've got to bag that flower before it opens. As soon as it opens, the bees will be in there and leading to possible cross-pollination. And if you go into all of this work, then you want it to work. So you might as well bag that flower before it opens. Don't leave it to chance. And then this is more of a demonstration photo. You can see there's some insects in there doing no good. But you can see that we've got the male flower with the petals pulled off. We emasculate the male flower and we dab that pollen on the female flower. So that's us being the pollinator of transferring the male pollen to the female flower. Fertilization happens. We put the bag back on the flower so there can't be any additional pollen in the mix. And then when the flower naturally dies off and the fruit forms behind it, then we know that that fruit will contain pure seed and we've achieved our seed saving mission. We label that fruit and it's the same as all the other crops we've talked about. Super simple and straightforward at that point. We allow it to go to maturity and we have the seeds, and we'll talk about the processing at the end. So that's squash, or any plant that's monoecious, which covers all of these guys here. They're all in the Cucurbitaceae family. So like the squash, the melon family, cucumbers, watermelons. The flowers are different sizes, but once you start looking at them, they're very similar. and they're all monoecious, and you'd have to go through this process for all of them. Squash is the easiest place to start because of the size of the flower. It's very visual what's going on. So I would learn on a squash before trying it on a cucumber, would be my advice. But yeah, hand pollination can be fun. Okay, so the last crop type deals with our last kind of situation, and corn demonstrates this really well. What we're seeing is a crop which is monoecious. So in that way, it's like our squash. We have separate male and female flowers on our corn plant. They just don't look like flowers. That's the thing that gets people. What we're seeing on the left is the tassel, which forms at the top of the corn plant, and that's the male pollen-producing flower. And you've probably experienced this if you're growing corn, that if you like shake the corn at the right plant, you get all this pollen falling out, and it's all falling from the male flowers at the top of the plant. And then the silks that form from the cob are the female pollen-receiving flowers. And the cool thing with corn is that each of those individual silks is an individual flower that all has the style that reaches back into the ovary, and the ovary is the corn kernel. So the corn kernel grows into the fruit. So a cob is actually a collection of often hundreds of individual fruit, which have all been individually pollinated by one of these silks. So when you get a cob that doesn't have very good kernel set, like you're missing kernels, it's often a pollination issue, and that's why they tell you to plant corn in blocks and make sure you got a lot of it, so you get good pollination to get good kernel formation. So it's kind of a cool one to think about or to appreciate on that level. But that pollen is really, 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 really light, and the flowers are not very floral. And so we don't see much insect activity for pollination mechanisms on corn. It's a wind pollinated crop. There's not a lot of vegetable crops that are wind pollinated, but corn is one of the key ones. And as soon as you know that something is wind pollinated, you're often dealing with quite large isolation distances, because there's the potential for that pollen to kind of be picked up by a wind, a gust, and actually blown quite a large distance. And again, the numbers vary massively, and location can affect wind pollinated crops. Like, we're kind of lucky in the mountains that we'll have lots of natural barriers and blockades, and you can get away with shorter isolation distances. But out on the plains of Iowa, they'll often talk about, you know, multiple miles of isolation distance required to prevent cross-pollination. So corn can be challenging, very challenging from a distance perspective, because those tassels form up high, and often the tassels will form at slightly different times to the silks. Then the whole bagging and pollen collection is very feasible, but much harder to do with corn than it is with squash. So while I would encourage you to go ahead and give it a go, it's the same principle as with the squash flower. It's a challenge. So I like to use isolation by time when I'm growing multiple varieties of corn. So this is actually my first child. So this was 5 years ago. But it's a pretty good picture to show that in the background, you can see one variety of corn. You can see it's all tasseling at the back. It's kind of short and tasseling. And at the front, you can see a much taller variety of corn that hasn't begun to tassel yet. So by paying attention to the flowering window of the varieties you're planting, as long as those two varieties are not flowering at the same time, then there can be no cross-pollination. They can only cross-pollinate if they're producing pollen in the same window. So I go ahead and plant like a fast-producing corn first, as soon as I can in the season, knowing that it'll be up and raring to go and creating pollen pretty quickly. I'll wait a couple of weeks and plant a much slower growing, like heirloom corn that will be producing way later in the season, knowing that I can be pretty confident they won't be flowering in the same window. So it's a real easy way to like circumnavigate all of the challenges just by planting them at different times. And this technique can be used for any of the other crops as well. Summer squash might be a good option for that. You could plant an early round of one squash, And then once it's done its peak yield, have a second one coming into production and just squash off each one and stop it from flowering while the second one's producing. So you can play around with it, but you can see that we're starting to go down the rabbit hole of more hands-on, more effort, more thought, and we're all real people with real gardens and real lives. So it can become more and more challenging the deeper you go. So that's why I like this technique of just plant them at different times. You don't have to worry about it. So that's isolation by time. So that's kind of covered our four crops and four main things, which is you can isolate by species, which is just, only plant one variety of one species. So that's pretty simple. You can isolate by distance, and that depends on the crop, and you can look that up. You can isolate with a physical barrier, and then you might have to get involved with hand pollination depending on whether it's a perfect or a monoecious plant. And then you can isolate by time with a little bit of planning. So that's our main isolation techniques, so that we can really have control of who pollinates who, which is back to our primary role of the seed saver. So I throw this slide in right at the end, just to remind me to go back to that point I made, that if we're just vegetable gardening, in general, we don't have to worry about any of this. You can plant as many different varieties from as many different species wherever you want, and it doesn't matter if they share pollen. And that's because most of the thing we eat on a fruit is maternal tissue, and which comes from the mother plant. So the genetics are set. You like what you're going to get is what you're going to get. And then that male pollen that comes in is only present in a small amount in the seed. So for most things, that cross-pollination is not going to affect the fruit at all. There's a few crops where the majority of what we eat is the seed. And that's where we can see we can sometimes see the effects of cross-pollination in the first season in the food crop. And that's what you're seeing here with this corn, is that this was meant to be I think it was a Carl's glass gem or one of the colored corns. And we've obviously had cross-pollination by a yellow corn with that dominant color that has come in that first generation. We're seeing that we've had this accidental cross-pollination. It doesn't happen very often. You'll see it sometimes in the peppers. So you'll eat your sweet pepper and it will be spicy. And it can often be because most of the spice is concentrated in the seeds. And again, if you've had cross-pollination from a hot pepper in that season. So it happens occasionally, but not often. And for the most part, I don't worry about it for food crops. And I just, for seed crops, again, it's critical that we avoid this cross-pollination, because now we've got a jumble of genetics that we have to deal with or start over the next season. Okay. Oh, so these are other wind-pollinated crops, spinach, beets, and chard, just so you got them as a reference of other things that that behave similarly in terms of their isolation distance and wind. Okay, so that's kind of like the chunk of those four crops and techniques, and hopefully that's enough to kind of just allow you to go and give it a go. We've got 15-20 minutes left to go through a few kind of just notes that I feel it's important to at least have in the slideshow so you can go back and reference them. And then we'll finish with the harvesting seed processing, which, as we said at the beginning, is the easiest part of it all. That's the real quick bit at the end, is just kind of pulling the carrot out of the ground and learning how to store it. So I've left this picture of corn up here. This is a note on sulfurs, outcrosses, and inbreeding depression. It's a text-heavy slide, and again, I just want it there for kind of making sure that your education is complete and for later reference. But just to quickly go through it, we've talked about perfect flowers. Most of them can self-pollinate, so they're self-fertile. We've talked about all of these on the list now: the okra, lettuce, beans, peas, tomatoes. They're generally called selfers. If they're capable of self-pollinating, they get referred to as a whole group of selfers. So that's a good place to start as a beginner seed saver, because they're easy. We do have a small group of flowers that are technically perfect flowers. They have male and female organs, but they're self-incompatible. They're not self-fertile. So they can't pollinate themselves, even though they have the sexual organs to technically do it. And this is most of the brassica crops, like the broccolis and the cauliflowers, they're self-incompatible. And that's something that the plants developed to make sure that it doesn't pollinate itself, and it forces it to share pollen with other plants. So it's kind of maintaining its own genetic promiscuity and making sure that there's a good mix of genetics. So we call them outcrosses. So selfers have generally evolved to be totally cool with effectively having sex with themselves. They can be totally inbred and not really suffer from any genetic degradation. So they're the selfers, and they're good with that. You can save seeds from just one tomato and not really worry about it too much. But when it comes to things like outcrosses, they've developed these mechanisms where they need to share a lot of pollen in order to maintain a good mix-up of genetics. If they don't get that mix-up of genetics, then they quickly suffer from inbreeding depression, and your plants will go downhill really quickly. So if you've been saving your own broccoli seed for a couple of years just from one or two plants, then you've got a very narrow bottleneck of genetics, and that's going to severely impact the population with outcrossing types in a way that it wouldn't with selfers. So if this is going over your head, don't worry about it. This is kind of branching on 201, but it's good to have this somewhere in your brain. So inbreeding depression is a real thing. So when you look at these reference manuals, the seed garden book, it'll tell you what's the number of plants you need for viable seed, and that can just be a handful of plants. But to maintain genetic integrity, that number is going to be a lot more for outcrosses, and it can be. I just looked up brassicas. Actually, somebody asked me about kale, and it says you need 80 kale plants going to seed and sharing pollen within that population to maintain genetic integrity within a kale population. So that can become a challenge or a barrier for seed savers on a small scale. I think it can be circumnavigated through seed swaps. You can save your seed 1 year and then go and mix it with a neighbor, and you're getting a genetic mix-up that way. But it's definitely something to think about with some of these outcrosses. In general, the monoecious plants that we talked about, like the cucurbits and the corn, they will almost always be outcrosses. That like two different flowers is an outcrosser mechanism. And then we've got this final small subset of plants in the vegetable world where you actually have separate male and female plants. You see it more often in trees than you do with vegetables, but spinach is a good example. You actually have male and female plants that are separate. But you can, in terms of seed saving, you can kind of treat it like a monoecious plant. So just keep that there as reference, and don't get too caught up on all those terms. And let's go into the harvest and seed storage for the final part. Let me, Kathy, any questions popped up before we do this final section?
No questions.
Cool. I like this audience.
You must be covering everything.
Either that or no one's there. I can't see anybody. Has everyone left? Okay. Awkward silence.
There's a bunch of us.
Oh, okay. So one thing for all crops is to appreciate that the botanical maturity of a crop is different to the market maturity sometimes. So what's that mean? Market maturity is when you would go to the farmer's market and buy something. So for a cucumber, you would go and buy a cucumber when the skin was thin, the seeds were barely visible, or if they were in there, then they'd kind of be soft and crunchy and pleasant to chew through. If you got to a point where you were buying a cucumber at market and it was large and gnarly and you had to hacksaw through the skin and the seeds were solid, then you'd be pretty annoyed. But that's the stage you need to get the cucumber to have botanical maturity. Botanical maturity is when you have seeds that are able to reproduce themselves. And usually it happens right at the end of the plant's life. The plant does everything else first, and then that mature seed happens right at the end. So it's just being aware of it and making sure that you know which plants have that different like harvest windows. So cucumbers are a real good example. You really need it to go big and gnarly, bigger even than that one on the left. That's still green. Once a lot of cucumbers go yellow and kind of just a bit rugged looking once they get to full maturity. Peppers is a good example. We every year we get people coming into Sow True Seeds saying, I want a good green pepper variety. Can you recommend a green pepper variety? And we explain that all peppers are green pepper varieties when they're immature, and they mature through to their color. So you can see in this picture, the pepper isn't botanically mature in terms of having viable seed until we get all the way through to the full deep red, and maybe it's even starting to dry down a little bit. And all those other peppers before it will not, even though you could eat them, the seeds wouldn't be viable in those peppers. Tomatoes, you know, this is a nasty, horrible tomato that you would never eat, but it's at full maturity, and those seeds are probably ripe and raring to go in terms of getting ready to germinate. You don't have to let your tomatoes go moldy for them to be fully mature. But if you have a tomato that falls off the plant because it's so ripe, then maybe that becomes your seed saving stock. So it's not wasted. Okra is the classic one. You eat it when it's green and tender, but from flowering to eating is about 5 days, but from flowering to mature seed is about 40 days. So you've got to give it that extra time in the field, which is another consideration for you to think about as a seed saver. You've got to allow the plants to have the time to produce the mature seed. Now there's other examples. Winter squash is a great one. The mature seeds are ready when the squash is mature. So you can kind of do both with that one. Tomatoes we quickly referenced. You can harvest a nice ripe tomato and still save the good seed from that. So some things sink and some things don't, and just be aware of the difference. Okay, so we've harvested our mature crop, whatever that might be, and we're going to drop into one of two processing techniques. The first one is wet processing, and if we harvest the seed and at harvest it's wet or slimy, then we do wet processing. The other one is dry processing, which is when we harvest them dry. So we'll cover that one in a second. People get a little bit intimidated with this because it can involve a fermentation process, but it's really quite simple. You take your tomato, you've realized that it's kind of gloopy. That gloopiness is a germination inhibitor. It's like a gelatinous placental layer that stops it germinating. And if you were just to put that in a jar and store it until next year, you'd get mold and nastiness and stuff like that. So what we want to do is scoop it out, put it in a jar, and depending on how wet that tomato is, you might want to add a little bit of liquid, and you just leave it for a couple of days and it'll start fermenting a little bit like a sauerkraut, which means it'll go kind of scummy and smell bad. You get this white scum on top, but what that's doing is breaking down that gelatinous layer. As with fermentation for vegetables, the temperature will affect the rate of the fermentation, but we're looking at 24 to 48 hours is a good ballpark for fermenting these things. And then once you got to this stage, it's just a case of rinsing them. I keep them in the jars and I just fill it up with water, like a powerful jet of water, and pour off, and all the gunk floats to the top and the good seeds sink to the bottom. You're going to lose some seeds from the top, but usually the floaters are not viable anyway. They've got air in them. So you're pouring off all the gunk and the bad seeds, and you just repeat that process a couple of times, and you end up with these clean seeds. You can do a final rinse. And at this stage, then, if you take a tomato seed straight out of a tomato and go like this, it might ping out and hit somebody in the eye. But if you do it with these clean fermented seeds, they're going to be almost grippy. And that's what we're going for, a nice, clean, grippy seed. Our aim is to have a clean, dry seed at the end of it. So from this stage, we want to quickly get them dried, not with heat, just kind of, you can run a fan on it if it's humid. I like doing it in labeled coffee filters because once they're dry, I can then roll these up, and they're my seed packets as well. So this works really well for me with tomato seeds. Tomato seeds are very small, so they dry quickly. Squash seeds is the same process. Scoop, ferment. Once it's gone funky, rinse to get the gloop off. They should be non-slippery at this point. And then I'd lay these on dehydration racks. If it's humid, I can run my dehydrator without any temperature, so it just runs a fan, and I find that really dries them quickly. But air drying is enough. Don't put them in your oven. It's just more likely, if it goes above 95 Fahrenheit, you're gonna really impact the germination of those seeds. So just passive air drying is generally enough. But you might want to give squash seeds a little bit longer than you would tomato seeds. So, oh look, wrong picture. So wet processing involves fermentation, but shouldn't be intimidating, and it's very quick and easy. Just a little bit of water, 2 to 3 days fermenting, rinse, dry, and then you've got a clean dry seed for storage. Dry processing, the seed is already dry, so you don't have to worry about the fermentation process. Ignore the melon picture. Oh, I know why. Let me, I'm kind of getting close to time, but I really want to show you this process. Hey, it's Lily. Am I on screen share right now, Kathy, or can you see me in big?
Yes, you are on screen share, but we don't have any images at the moment.
How do I turn off screen share? Go away.
Stop share up at the top.
Oh yeah, thank you. Okay, so I should be back in full now, and you should be able to see my fan in the background. So dry processing of seeds is anything that comes in dry. So these are southern peas that were harvested last year, and I haven't got around to cleaning yet. I started crushing the pods, but you can see the pods come in dry and crunchy, so they're crisp and brittle, and that allows you to get all the seeds together and just really kind of macerate them and break open the pods, and so all the seeds kind of fall out, and you're left with this mess of like we call it the chaff. You got the seeds and you got the chaff. It's generally just the seed detritus. We want to get rid of all that because some of those things can be disease vectors. So again, we want a clean, dry seed for storage. If you're just doing a handful of these or a couple of pods of okra, you can, sit with your children in front of Netflix and just hand shell them. And that's a very effective, viable way to save seeds on a small scale. If you're growing these, this can be you do this for food as well, or a larger amount of seeds, then you can automate this process to some extent. And I'm going to show you fan winnowing, which is pretty fun. If any of you are school teachers and you want to do this with kids, it's lots and lots of fun to do, and it's very quick and effective for getting rid of all that nasty small particulate side, like the dust and the smaller debris that you can't otherwise get rid of. So once you've done that crunching stage, you do a shaking stage, and the heavy seeds fall to the bottom. You can do this on a huge scale with a tarpaulin. And the same, you can stamp on the seeds to break them apart with your children, and then shake the top and all the heavy seeds go to the bottom. They're pretty tough at this stage, or if they're not tough, they're probably not mature enough, so it doesn't matter if you squish them.
Hey, Chris, can I just bust in here for a second and let people know to, if you want to be able to see Chris big and see the process, go up to the top, and on the right hand side there's a gallery view or a speaker view, and if you click on speaker view, then you'll be able to see Chris much larger. The gallery view just shows all of our pictures. So
thank you, Kathy. Okay, I'm doing this a little bit quick, but basically with that shaking, the big empty pods came to the top and the heavy seeds went to the bottom, and you can be a little bit more careful with it, but basically what you're left with is mainly seeds and then a whole lot of this little stuff, which would be incredibly annoying to pick out, and that's where the winnowing stage comes into it. So we have this kind of threshing stage to break apart the seeds from the pods, and then we do the winnowing stage. So I'm just going to show it, but basically I'm just pouring the seeds in front of a fan. I have a container just off camera that is going to catch the seeds, and it's a real quick way to clean them. So you can remember what these look like, and I'll show you the after. So just like super quickly, we've now got like real clean seeds. Some of the bigger pods that I didn't break apart, most of them have still got seeds in. So I've got a little bit left in there. I would do this 2 or 3 times. Like you can see, it's very quick. Just go and bash them through, and you end up with all the little dusty stuff just disappears. And I did this with a big Southern pea type variety, but I've done this with amaranth. I've done it with basil, and some of the smaller seeds that can be really annoying to process. You've got to play around with your fan setting and the distance that it drops to make sure that you're not like prematurely sowing things in your living room. But apart from that, you can get very nuanced with which seeds you work with. If it's a really, really, really fine seed, you can do it in reverse. Like you can use the suction of the fan from the back to kind of pull the seeds instead of blow them. And just playing around with this concept allows you to clean a whole wide range of seeds. I don't have any, but it's fairly common to see seed screens. So that's the other way to process dry seeds, is just to have mesh sizes of different dimensions, and then you can kind of just sift the seeds and it'll catch the chaff and let the seed through, or keep the seed and let the chaff through. And so with different sizes, you can get pretty clean seed fairly quickly. So a combination of a fan and some simple seed screens, or just like hardware mesh, you can get seeds surprisingly clean, surprisingly quickly. So
Chris, we have a couple of questions / comments, if you don't mind right now.
Please go for it.
Okay. Well, Ona says, so cool about the winnowing process. And then from Dina, she says, if you have to wait until the fruit is grown to determine if you want to save the seed because it tastes great or is disease resistant, haven't you missed the chance to ensure the seeds are pure, i.e. when the flowers are present? How do you address that?
That's a wonderful question. So genetically speaking, the if you get a tomato and you know what plant it came from and it's absolutely delicious, then you can go and save any other tomato on that plant and it should have a pretty good representation of the same genetics. So it's not like every single fruit is different. So that it's a better example with the okra, because once you've realized that it tastes really good, you've kind of already gone ahead and eaten what you want to save. But it doesn't matter, because once you've identified a really top performing plant, then you can just save one of the other pods and you'll be capturing the same kind of genetics. With the disease resistance, in terms of saving seeds from the tomato plant that survives the longest, because the tomatoes don't really need much extra effort, then it's kind of an easy one to get around, because I just wait to see which plant is still alive and producing at the end, and I just snag a mature tomato, and that's my seed straight away there. So I'm not thinking of any straight off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's examples where you'll have to put a little more thought in, and if you're really doing specific selection techniques, you're gonna have to keep really good records of which fruit came from which plant, so that when you're doing the taste test or whatever it is you're doing with that fruit, you can go, oh, this is superior, it's like a really soft flesh or whatever, and go back to the same plant to then harvest a seed stock from those genetics. So it's all about the genetics and not necessarily the specific fruit. So I hope that kind of answers that one, but it's a good question for sure. I've got this slide. Was there any more, Kathy?
That's it.
Cool. So last couple of slides, I just wanted to put this one up for storage. Different seeds have different longevities. You see these charts kind of like, oh, I didn't create this chart. This is from the internet. And generally things will fall into the same kind of categories, so you get some consistency. These always seem to be on the conservative side, to me, like really conservative side. And so I tend to have more faith in the seed if it's saved well and stored well. I think these may be kind of like industry charts that go out there so that people don't get too disappointed. Like, I know so many people that save tomatoes for a long time and will reliably tell you that they will survive with 100% germination for at least 10 years. And okra will give you at least 4 to 5 years if you store it well without too much drop in germination. So take this with a pinch of salt, but it's kind of useful as a guide. What's more critical in my mind is how you store them. This is just a picture from Sotru Seed. We're lucky enough to have like a walk-in cold room that's kept at 50% Fahrenheit, 50 Fahrenheit and 50% humidity. And it's got like an air filter in there too. So it's a pretty ideal storage space. Seeds get kept either in buckets or jars, and then we put the silica gel packets in the jars so that we can absorb any trace moisture there as well. So moisture is really important. We end up with these 3 rules, which is to keep the seeds dry, dark, and cool. So dry, I think, is the most critical. Dark is good. That can be like a brown glass jar in an interior closet or a basement. And then cool, I think a stable temperature is most important. And then the cooler you can get that stable temperature is the next but most important. So if you've got like a regulated house, then you can keep it in a interior closet, even if it's 70 Fahrenheit, as long as it's fairly stable. I keep most of my stuff in the basement in glass jars so that it stays dry, dark, and cool. You can refrigerate seeds. Just make sure that you don't get any moisture in them. So definitely a sealed container. You can freeze seeds, and that will give you even more life out of the seeds. The risk with freezing them is if the seeds aren't dry enough when they go in the freezer and there's like trace moisture on the embryo and that freezes, then you can kind of kill a seed. So you might have the potential to store those seeds for 25 years, but do you really need to? And is it worth the risk of maybe destroying the seed? So, just kind of weigh them up against each other. Most of my seeds that I'm reusing every couple of years, I don't waste freezer space on, and I just keep them in my basement in glass jars. And it's only when I either have a seed that I just want to put into long-term storage that it ends up in the freezer or the fridge. So just know those 3 principles and you can kind of make your own good decisions. Okay, so that's the main material that we've gone through. That is like, I appreciate and understand that there's a lot of information there to go at, but I want to say, I've said it twice now, so this is the 3rd time, don't get overwhelmed by the details. Know that the actual numbers are easily referenceable, and just focus on some of these overarching techniques and go out there and be a botanical observer, look at the flowers and give it a go. And seed saving can be really easy and accessible for everyone. So really just give it a go and kind of learn on the job. So this is the Utopian Seed Project. You can check us out online, and that's our Instagram handle. This is me personally. There's a blog that I never get enough time to update, but my okra book is up there. And then that's me on Instagram if you want to expose yourself to a collection of okra photographs of my children and some garden shots. So fair warning. And then this is the promised link to the seed saving presentation if you want to go back and reference anything, although obviously Bountiful Cities are also going to be putting it in their educational library online as well, so you can access it from 2 directions. So that is pretty much me. I'm gonna actually I'll leave that up for a second so that you can make sure you've written it down. Seed saving 101.
you've been getting lots of thank yous in the chats.
Could we put that link in the chat? Would that help?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Can I do that? Can you do that?
Yeah.
Thank you, Tech Wizard.
Hardly.
I think. Yeah, I think I've showed you everything I had to show. If we had another month, I would have